Pick that up, sweetheart. That is what Dr. Caldwell said 47 minutes before a bullet would expose every lie he'd ever told. Cedar Creek Medical in Savannah hums with fluorescent lights and antiseptic smell. The kind of smell that never leaves your clothes, never leaves your skin. Natalie Hayes moves through the ICU with unusual precision for someone 3 weeks into a nursing contract. Her hands are steady. They have to be. She checks vitals on Captain Marcus Webb in room 304, watching the cardiac monitor trace its familiar peaks and valleys. Sinus rhythm. Stable. The way it should be. Webb is recovering from his 3rd combat tour, shrapnel still embedded near his left hip, ribs still healing under bandages she changes with the careful attention of someone who understands what fragile means. She wears long sleeves despite the Georgia heat climbing toward 92 degrees by mid-morning. The sleeves hide scars that run down both forearms like a topographic map of consequences. Shrapnel. RPG fragmentation. 20 years ago in Fallujah, Jolan district. She doesn't think about that when she's working. Thinking is a luxury she can't afford right now. In her locker, buried beneath clean scrubs and a cardigan she never wears, sits a pair of combat boots. Leather cracked. Laces frayed at the ends. The soles still hold dirt from a desert she left 2 decades behind. Brown stains mark the insides of both boots, dried dark, the kind of dark that doesn't come from mud. She never quite cleaned them. Some things aren't meant to be cleaned. Some things are meant to remember. Natalie has been at Cedar Creek Medical for exactly 3 weeks, 2 days, and 4 hours. Long enough to establish her cover. Long enough to access patient charts. Long enough to notice that Captain Marcus Webb's billing records don't match his treatment timeline. Procedures listed that never happened. Medications charged but never administered. Her jaw tightened the first time she saw it. Master Chief Petty Officer training taught her to recognize patterns. This was a pattern. A specific kind of predatory pattern. She moves to the medication cart, her hands moving on their own now, muscle memory from 12 years of active duty, from 3 separate tours through Helmand Province and Sanjin Valley. The cart squeaks slightly as she pulls it forward. The squeaking echoes in the quiet morning ICU. Only 2 other nurses on the floor at this hour, and they're both absorbed in their own patients. The fluorescent lights buzz overhead like insects trapped in plastic. Everything about Cedar Creek Medical is designed to be forgettable. Anonymous. Perfect for someone who needs to disappear into a role. But she isn't forgettable. She's just very good at being invisible. Dr. Caldwell enters the ICU at 6:24 a.m., clipboard tucked under his arm like a weapon. His shoes click against the linoleum in a rhythm that speaks of confidence. Entitlement. He's 48, with the kind of tan that comes from golf course weekends, hair graying at the temples in a way his tailor probably charged extra to ensure looked distinguished. He walks past the nursing station without acknowledging anyone, eyes narrowing slightly as he watches Natalie linger over Webb's chart. Her hands freeze for exactly 1 second. Then they resume, turning the page with mechanical precision. She knows what he sees. A young-looking woman in her 40s with brown eyes and a build that says she takes care of herself. A nurse who's been asking too many questions about billing protocols. A nurse who needs to leave before she notices what he's doing. Before she becomes a problem. Caldwell's presence makes the air pressure change. Not because he's powerful, he's not really, but because he moves through the world assuming he is. Assuming no one will challenge him. Assuming the residents who follow him around like remoras on a shark will laugh when he makes jokes at someone else's expense. Assuming he's untouchable. The cafeteria is crowded at 7:15 a.m. It's a Tuesday, early March, and the morning light through the east-facing windows cuts across the tile floor in long geometric patterns. Natalie stands in the food line with her tray. Coffee. Oatmeal. Toast. Nothing that matters. She's already eaten. This is just maintenance, the kind of routine civilians use to organize their days. Around her, doctors and nurses move through their own rituals. A resident laughs loudly near the juice dispenser. Someone's pager chirps. A coffee machine hisses steam. Dr. Caldwell sees her at the table. His eyes zero in the way a predator's eyes zero in on movement. He crosses the cafeteria in a straight line. His two residents follow, trailing behind like disciples waiting for a teaching moment. His smile is the kind of smile that teaches you something about a person. The kind that says he enjoys what he's about to do. The kind that says he's done this before. "Sweetheart," he says, his voice pitched loud enough for the entire break room to hear. "You're holding that tray like you actually know what you're doing." Natalie looks up. Her face is a mask. Practiced. Perfected over 2 decades in situations where showing emotion meant giving someone leverage. She says nothing. Waits. Let him continue. "Tell me, how long have you worked in healthcare?" He doesn't wait for an answer. He reaches out, his hand moving with casual certainty, and knocks the tray upward. Coffee arcs through the air. The oatmeal bowl tumbles. Toast scatters across the linoleum like fallen leaves. The tray itself clatters against the floor with a sound like a gunshot amplified through water. Everything stops. The resident with a loud laugh pulls out his phone. The other resident does the same. They're recording. Of course they're recording. "I asked you a question," Caldwell says, his voice still pleasant, still conversational. "Least you could do is answer." The paper scattered with the tray. Charts from Webb's medical file that Natalie had been reviewing over her break. Billing records. Medication logs. 2 pages of handwritten notes about discrepancies. They spread across the linoleum in a disaster pattern that looks accidental if you're not paying attention. If you don't know what you're looking at. Natalie kneels. The movement is smooth. Practiced. No hesitation. No shame radiating off her like heat. She doesn't close her eyes. Doesn't take a breath that looks like anything other than routine. Her hands gather the papers first, organized by type, stacking them with precision. The charts. The logs. The notes. She stacks them the way someone in the military stacks documents in a tactical brief. Efficient. Ordered. Revealing nothing. 3 weeks, she says quietly, her voice pitched low so only Caldwell can hear. "I've been here 3 weeks." She gathers the bowl. Still warm. Coffee-stained. She gathers the toast, though it's ruined now. She gathers everything. Her movements are economical. Military. The kind of movement that comes from having to move quickly under fire, the kind that never wastes motion. Caldwell watches her work. His residents film. The room stays quiet. The phones recording are held steady by people who understand they might be witnessing something worth keeping. Something worth sharing. "You know what I think," Caldwell says, and his voice carries an edge now, something sharper underneath the pleasant tone. "I think you won't last long here. I'm sensing a certain lack of adaptability. Healthcare requires flexibility. Acceptance of hierarchy." He looks at his residents. Both of them smile on cue, like fish trained to respond to a specific stimulus. "In fact, I'm going to make a bet. $500 says you quit within the week. Any takers?" The older resident nods immediately. The younger one hesitates, then nods too. They're complicit now. They've made a bet on a woman's breaking point. They've filmed it and sent it somewhere. The evidence is out there, multiplying across phones and cloud storage. Natalie stands. She's holding the ruined remains of her breakfast in both hands. The tray is balanced against her hip. She looks at Caldwell. Her eyes are the color of a winter Atlantic, flat and deep and containing no emotion whatsoever. She doesn't blink. Doesn't flinch. Doesn't let anything show. This is composure like a training exercise. This is the mask of someone who has survived things worse than a $500 bet about her endurance. "I'll take that bet," she says, her voice measured. But I think you're wrong about me. She turns and walks to the trash bin. Dumps the ruined breakfast. The coffee streams into the receptacle like brown water going down a drain. She sets the tray on the counter, walks out of the cafeteria, and doesn't look back. Caldwell's smile widens. His residents laugh. They've already sent the video somewhere. Somewhere public. Somewhere permanent. But something nags at him as he watches her leave. Something in the way she moved. The way her shoulders stayed level. The way her hands didn't tremble. The way she didn't cry or flush or show any of the signs he expects from people he breaks. He pushed, and she didn't break. He pushed harder, and she didn't break. He made a public spectacle, and she responded with the calm of someone who'd faced worse and survived it. For a moment, just one moment, Caldwell feels something he doesn't recognize. It tastes like fear. But he pushes it down. She's just a nurse. Just someone 3 weeks into a contract. She'll quit. They always quit. It's only a matter of time. What he doesn't know, what no one in that cafeteria knows, is that the woman they just witnessed gathering scattered papers with perfect composure was trained in 19 different weapons platforms. That she speaks Arabic fluently, Pashto passably, Dari well enough to extract wounded children from burning buildings. That she has saved 47 lives in direct combat situations. That she has been shot at by people who called her by a code name that translates to the Black Angel, and she survived every single bullet. What Caldwell doesn't know is that the woman he just made a $500 bet about is Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, Navy Special Forces, and she's at Cedar Creek Medical for exactly one reason: Captain Marcus Webb sleeping in room 304. The terrified 7-year-old boy she pulled from a burning Humvee in Fallujah 20 years ago. The boy who grew into a soldier. The soldier who came home broken and is now being systematically defrauded by the man Caldwell works for. What Caldwell doesn't know is that Natalie has already filed 12 separate insurance fraud complaints with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. That she has access to encrypted communications with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. That the nursing contract she's on is actually a covert operation running under a different name entirely. What Caldwell doesn't know is that he just made a very specific mistake. He made her personal. Natalie walks back to room 304. The morning light is brighter now, past 7:30, past the point where she can pretend this is just another shift. She checks Webb's vitals again. Blood pressure stable. Heart rate steady. O2 sat at 98%. Everything exactly as it should be. She adjusts his fall line, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who has done this 1,000 times, in 1,000 different contexts, under circumstances most people couldn't survive. Webb is sleeping. His face is different than it was 20 years ago. It's harder. Carved by experiences that changed him. But she remembers the young face underneath. The terror in his eyes when she pulled him from the Humvee. The way he held onto her in the helicopter like she was the only real thing in a world that was falling apart. She remembers pulling him from burning metal. She remembers the scar on her left shoulder from shrapnel she took so that scar wouldn't be on him. She remembers deciding, in that moment, that some oaths don't end when you leave the battlefield. Some oaths carry into civilian hospitals and crooked doctors and $500 bets made by men who don't understand that they're already defeated. Natalie reaches into her locker later that day, during her break. She doesn't need to. She just needs to remember. The combat boots are still there. Still stained. Still carrying the weight of that day in Fallujah. She touches the leather. It's warm from the Florida heat bleeding through the locker. She doesn't cry. She never cries. But something in her crystallizes. Something becomes very, very sharp. Caldwell made his bet at 7:23 a.m. By 8:15 p.m., exactly 12 hours and 47 minutes later, a man would walk into the Cedar Creek Medical ICU. He would demand access to Captain Marcus Webb. He would carry a 9mm pistol and explicit orders to finish what an IED started 20 years ago in Fallujah. Caldwell didn't know that either. None of them did. The chart felt heavier than usual in Natalie's hands at 2:15 p.m. when she pulled Captain Webb's file from the ICU records cabinet. Day 21. The shift change had just begun, and she'd taken her 15-minute break in the staff cafeteria like everyone else, moving through the crowd with the invisibility of someone people had decided not to see. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless drone overhead as she stood at the counter, tray balanced on her palms, chicken sandwich, apple slices, black coffee, when Dr. Caldwell stepped directly into her path. His shoulder caught the tray's edge first. The deliberate angle of his approach made it clear this wasn't an accident. Charts scattered across the linoleum like playing cards, applesauce splattering her white shoes, the sandwich landing face down near the trash bin. 30 people stopped eating. The room didn't go silent, the room held its breath. "Pick that up, sweetheart," Dr. Caldwell said, loud enough for the residents 3 tables over to turn. His voice carried the casual cruelty of someone who'd never experienced actual consequences. "We can't have the help making messes all over the place." Natalie knelt. Her jaw clenched once, a single muscle spasm she couldn't suppress, and then her face went smooth as glass. Her hands moved across the tile, gathering papers with perfect steadiness, arranging them in alphabetical order despite the applesauce soaking into the bottom edges. Dr. Morris and Dr. Chen had their phones out, recording, laughing that particular laugh of people who believed they were on the winning side. "I'll bet $500 she quits within the week," Caldwell announced, directing this statement to the residents like he was making a formal declaration. "Look at her. Too proud to scrub floors, too incompetent to do anything else." Something breaks inside people like that, usually takes about 20 days. One of the residents actually pulled out his wallet. Natalie continued her work, cataloguing the damage, 18 pages with staining, 4 with coffee rings, 1 with a corner torn. Her mind ran parallel tracks, 1 on the immediate task, 1 somewhere colder, processing information the way a thermal sight processes heat signatures. She could see exactly how the applesauce would dry on the leather of these shoes if she didn't treat it quickly. She could also see that Dr. Caldwell's left hand had developed a tremor since yesterday, that he'd worn the same tie twice in 3 days, that the tightness around his eye suggested someone whose sleep had fragmented. Signs of stress. Signs of a man building something that was beginning to crack. She stood, charts reorganized, and carried them back to the records room. Behind her, Caldwell was already laughing at something one of the residents had said, the moment already abandoned in his mind, filed away as a successful exertion of dominance. He had no idea what she'd found an hour earlier in Captain Webb's file. No concept of the scope of the hole he was digging. At 3:13 p.m., Dr. Caldwell cornered her at the nurse's station. The hallway was busy enough that this wouldn't be private, but not so busy that anyone would intervene. He threw a stack of patient files at her chest, not hard enough to hurt, just hard enough to be insulting. The papers fanned as they fell. 3 files hit the floor. Refile these alphabetically. Apparently that's a challenging concept. She caught 2 of them without a word, bent to retrieve the 3rd, and stood holding them against her body. Her eyes met his for 1 second, just long enough to acknowledge she'd heard, then she turned toward the records room. 2 nurses watched in complete silence. That particular kind of silence that happens when people are afraid of being next. In the records room, she moved through the files methodically, but her attention was elsewhere. Captain Marcus Webb, age 27, admitted 79 days ago with complications from his 3rd combat tour. She pulled his entire history, comparing discharge notes against billing codes. The pattern emerged immediately once she knew to look for it. For procedures listed for Webb that never appeared in his daily physician notes. A CT scan performed on a day he was sedated post-surgery and couldn't have left his bed. A surgical consultation signed by a cardiologist on a date when that cardiologist wasn't even in Savannah. She'd checked the staff schedule. $18,000 in phantom services. She photographed 3 pages with her phone, hands rock steady, the kind of muscle memory that came from field documentation under fire. Then she dove deeper. The system flagged other military patients, 15 total across 8 months, all with the same pattern. VA insurance processed more slowly. Families deployed overseas less likely to question charges. The pattern wasn't random. It was calculated. It was also generating approximately $214,000 in fraudulent claims that would be nearly impossible to trace if no one was specifically looking for it. At 4:23 p.m., Dr. Caldwell paged her to the supply closet. A hallway away from witnesses, just far enough that her response time would matter. He stood in the doorway while she began counting 4 bags, the explicit task he'd assigned as punishment. 123. 124. When I hire someone, I expect competence, he said, watching her work. Apparently that's not something everyone's capable of. So far, I'm not seeing any reason to keep you on. She continued counting. Her voice came out deferential, careful, the voice of someone who believed she had something to lose. I'll do better, doctor. Whatever you need me to improve on. 138. 139. He left before she finished, satisfied. She completed the count anyway, 147 4 bags total, inventory recorded, task finished correctly despite the deliberate humiliation. In the bathroom afterward, alone, she gripped the sink edge hard enough to whiten her knuckles. The metal was cold beneath her skin. The mirror showed her a woman in blue scrubs with applesauce still dried on one shoe, her jaw tight enough to ache, her eyes the color of a storm waiting to break. She stared at her reflection for exactly 10 seconds, letting herself feel the anger, not the righteous anger of someone who'd been wronged, but the tactical anger of someone assembling a case. Then she breathed, released the sink, and returned to the floor. At 8:56 p.m., she pulled Captain Webb's chart one final time before making rounds. The early discharge notation was still there, still flagged in red. 48 hours ahead of standard protocol. Transfer to Savannah Regional Civilian Hospital, a facility with a known shortage of ICU beds and a reputation for rapid turnover. Webb was scheduled to leave tomorrow night. Once he transferred out of Cedar Creek, any complications that arose would become someone else's problem. Any evidence of his current condition would no longer be in Caldwell's care. It was perfect, in a way. Perfectly calculated. She cross-referenced Webb's vital signs from the past 79 days and noticed something else. The medications listed yesterday didn't match the medications documented in his current chart. A diuretic removed 2 days ago. A cardiac monitoring protocol discontinued without notation. Small adjustments. The kind that wouldn't raise flags unless someone was specifically looking, unless someone understood the cumulative effect of reducing monitoring on a patient whose stability was fragile. At 9:03 p.m., Webb's monitor spiked. Natalie was already in the hallway, already moving before the alarm finished its first cycle. His heart rate was climbing, 94, 102, 118, and his oxygen saturation was dropping in parallel. She reached his bedside in 4 seconds, 2 faster than any of the day shift nurses would have. His eyes were open, fear visible in the pupils, chest rising too fast. Can't breathe, he managed. Pressure. She checked his lung sounds, clear. Bilaterally, no crackles, no wheezing. That meant the problem wasn't in his lungs. That meant the pressure was coming from somewhere else, somewhere the lungs couldn't access. She knew what pericardiocentesis looked like from 23 years of field medicine. She knew what cardiac tamponade sounded like from the streets of Fallujah when a 7-year-old boy had been crushed under concrete and kept talking even as his lung collapsed, kept talking because his mind was still running even as his body was failing. She reached for the phone. Dr. Caldwell answered on the second ring. Page me if he decompensates. For now, anxiety attack. 2 milligrams at even, let him rest. His oxygen is dropping, doctor. 88% and declining. He's been stable for weeks. It's panic. Medicate him and monitor closely. The line disconnected. Natalie stood holding the phone, her face completely still. Around her, the ICU hummed its normal evening rhythms, beeping monitors, ventilator whoosh, the distant sound of a stretcher rolling down the corridor. She replaced the receiver, moved to Webb's bedside, and made a decision that would cost her everything. She positioned herself at his bedside anyway, directly against protocol, directly against Caldwell's orders. She pulled a blank notebook from her pocket and began documenting Webb's vitals manually, every minute, every reading, every breath. Her handwriting was precise despite her mind running tactical scenarios. She was 3 years into her undercover assignment. She'd accepted 12 days of humiliation to get this close. She'd let Caldwell see her as disposable, as weak, as someone he could discard when she became inconvenient. And now, at 9:28 p.m., she heard the elevator doors open on the ICU floor. Footsteps. Fast. Tactical. A man in a dark jacket moved past the nurse's station with the specific kind of purpose that meant he wasn't lost, wasn't visiting, wasn't supposed to be there. His eyes locked on room 304. On Captain Marcus Webb. On her. That was the moment everything changed. The chart came up on Natalie's screen at 8:36 p.m. Captain Webb. Discharge flagged for morning. She stared at the order. Not unusual by itself, patients moved through Cedar Creek like water through a filter. But the timing was catastrophic. Webb's cardiac status remained unstable. His left pleural effusion hadn't resolved. The man needed 5 more days of monitoring minimum, and Caldwell was pushing him out in 11 hours. Natalie's jaw tightened once. She understood what she was looking at. A witness removal. Caldwell had seen her attentiveness. Her notes. The way her charting caught inconsistencies in his orders that should never have existed. Webb could confirm those inconsistencies. Webb could testify that the patient monitoring protocols Caldwell had been sidestepping weren't arbitrary, they were life-saving. So Caldwell was eliminating the problem by eliminating Webb's medical justification to stay. She moved to the secure corner of the ICU, behind the med dispensary where the security cameras couldn't quite reach, and pulled out the encrypted phone she'd been carrying since before she ever put on the Cedar Creek scrubs. The device looked like a standard iPhone. It was military-grade intelligence hardware with Pentagon routing that would ring on an Admiral's desk inside 3 minutes. Her handler answered on the first ring. No greeting. Navy protocol. Hayes reporting. Captain Webb. Discharge order placed 20-40 hours. Suspicious timing relative to ongoing investigation. Patient remains medically unstable. Recommend immediate protective measures. Silence. Then, confirm Webb is in your visual space. Affirmative. ICU Bay 7. Still stable. For now. Extraction window. 0.5 hours. Maybe less. A longer pause. The kind where decisions get made at levels Natalie wasn't cleared to know about. Maintain position. Unit en route. Do not reveal. Do not deviate. We own this. The line went dead. Natalie powered down the phone and slid it back into her scrub pocket, her training already adjusting to this new reality. The undercover operation had just transformed from investigation to active protection. The timeline had compressed from weeks to minutes. At 8:54 p.m., Dr. Caldwell appeared at the ICU nurse station with the kind of movement that suggested a man who'd made a decision and wanted it executed immediately. He was holding Webb's chart, the physical copy, not the digital one Natalie had flagged, and his presence seemed to press the air out of the room like a hand closing around a throat. Everyone not essential to Bay 7 care is reassigned to opposite wing. Now. His voice carried the weight of authority backed by institutional privilege. He owned this hospital the way a man owns a suit he's been wearing for 15 years. We're prepping Captain Webb for discharge. Rapid protocol. Privacy measures in effect per discharge coordination. The 3 other nurses on shift exchanged glances. Reassignments mid-shift were unusual. Privacy measures for a discharge were unheard of. But Caldwell was the attending. His orders carried weight that nobody at Cedar Creek had learned to question. Natalie didn't move. Not yet. She continued her charting at the station, her handwriting steady and measured, her face showing nothing. The other nurses gathered their tablets and moved toward the opposite corridor, their footsteps fading toward pediatrics and the burn unit. Within 40 seconds, the ICU was functionally isolated. Just Webb in his bay. Just the machines breathing for him. Just the sound of the ventilator wheeze like something organic dying slowly in a dark room. Caldwell turned and looked directly at Natalie. His expression was perfectly smooth. "You included, Ms. Hayes. I have ongoing charting for Bay 7. She didn't look up. Her pen didn't hesitate. "Discharge preparation requires documentation." I said everyone not essential. The edge in his voice was a scalpel. "You're not essential to this patient's discharge." Natalie's hands didn't tremble. They moved across the chart with the same precision they would use to thread a needle through the eye of a surgical scope. She was doing something dangerous. She was ignoring a direct order from the attending physician. She was also making the only choice available to her, and Caldwell knew it. "I'll complete the chart outside the room." She looked up then, her eyes meeting his for exactly 2 seconds. Cold. Flat. Empty of anything he could use against her. Visual range. Standard protocol for high-risk discharge transition. Caldwell's jaw tightened. For an instant, something calculated flickered across his face, a man trying to decide if it was worth creating a scene that could be witnessed by security cameras and overheard by passing staff. He was competent enough to know that excessive force now would raise flags later. Better to let her sit outside the room, watching. Better to proceed with the order and move Webb out before whatever protection Natalie was hoping for could materialize. "Stay out of the bay." His voice was ice. "You hear nothing. You observe nothing. You document discharge standard and then you're gone. Understood?" "Understood, Doctor." He turned and entered Bay 7, the door sliding shut behind him with a hiss of hydraulics. Natalie gathered her tablet and her chart, the physical one, not the digital flag, and positioned herself outside the glass, approximately 4 feet from the doorframe, where she could see directly into the bay but wouldn't block the view of the central monitor. From here, she could see Webb's monitor. She could see the door. She could see down the main ICU corridor. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed in their mechanical rhythm, a sound so constant that most people stopped hearing it. Natalie heard it the way she'd been trained to hear everything, as data. The pitch was 60 Hz, standard North American electrical. The buzz indicated ballast degradation, probably 40% efficiency loss. The lights would fail sometime in the next 6 months. She was timing her breathing. 4 counts in. 6 counts hold. 4 counts out. The kind of breathing that kept adrenaline suppressed, that kept the body in a state of operational calm even while her mind was running calculations 6 moves ahead of the board. Caldwell was inside Bay 7. He had Webb's chart. He was accelerating the discharge. He believed the hospital security and his own institutional position would be enough to move an undercover Navy operative's asset out of protective custody without consequence. The next sound that came down the corridor wasn't urgent. It was almost casual. Footsteps. Male. Heavy tread. A gait that moved like someone who'd practiced the skill of appearing non-threatening while carrying lethal capability. The footsteps didn't match any hospital staff pattern Natalie had documented in 21 days. The man who appeared at the ICU entrance wore civilian clothes, dark hoodie, jeans, the kind of ensemble designed to be forgotten 30 seconds after seeing it. But his right hand was angled in a way that suggested a weapon beneath the fabric. His left hand held a badge and a clipboard. He was looking directly at Natalie. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was the second man behind him, standing at the corridor junction with his hand already positioned to move toward his jacket, and the recognition that hit Natalie's training like cold water: these weren't medical staff. These weren't hospital security. These were someone's hired operatives, and they were here to do something that couldn't be undone. The first man's eyes locked onto hers. A question. A confirmation. and then he turned toward Bay 7. The operative moved with lethal efficiency through the ICU corridor at 9:31 p.m., past a night shift nurse's aide restocking medication carts, past the monitoring station where 2 residents scrolled through discharge summaries. His jacket hung loose over a SIG Sauer P226 with suppressor, the kind of weapon that fires without announcing itself. The kind that ends conversations before they start. Dr. Caldwell had been clear on the phone 30 minutes earlier. He's a liability now. Too many records. Too many eyes. The operative didn't ask questions. He'd been paid $47,000 to finish what an IED in Fallujah had started 20 years ago. Natalie saw him at the moment his hand cleared his jacket. Not the gun itself at first, her peripheral vision caught the movement wrong, the angle that didn't belong in a hospital at 9:31 p.m. She was standing outside Bay 7, coffee cup at her hip, pretending to review Webb's monitor readout on the wall-mounted screen. Her handler's voice was still in her ear, transmitted through the wireless earbud disguised as a hearing aid, threat confirmed. JSOC is 12 minutes out. 12 minutes might as well have been 12 hours. The operative's eyes found Captain Webb through the observation window, a 46-year-old man who'd spent the last 16 hours regaining consciousness, whose cardiac status was improving by fractions of a percentage point with each passing hour, whose existence was worth exactly nothing to Dr. Caldwell's insurance fraud empire. The operative raised the SIG Sauer with the casual precision of someone who'd done this work in 7 countries across 3 continents. Natalie moved like muscle memory took over, because it did. 23 years of training, 8 combat deployments, 847 hours of close-quarters tactical training at Fort Bragg, all of it crystallizing into a single decision that took 1.3 seconds from recognition to execution. She didn't sprint. She didn't announce herself. She simply stepped into the space between the gun and her patient, her body a wall of scar tissue and certainty. The operative's expression shifted. Recognition, maybe. Annoyance. He adjusted his aim slightly downward, thought better of it, then simply pulled the trigger at center mass. 1 round. Suppressed. A sound like a stapler against the chaos of the ICU's constant electronic murmur. The bullet entered her left shoulder just above the collarbone and exited 3 inches lower, shattering her clavicle into fragments the orthopedic surgeons would later describe as comminuted, meaning broken into pieces too small to realign. The impact threw her backward against the observation window with enough force to crack the reinforced glass. She was conscious of the spreading warmth, the way her left arm stopped responding to instructions, the smell of copper and ozone and fierce sweat mixing in the recycled hospital air. She did not scream. She did not cry. She did not call for help. Instead, Natalie's right hand clamped down on her own left shoulder, fingers finding the entrance wound as orderlies rushed toward her, then toward Webb, carrying him toward the secure exit as protocol demanded. Security tackled the operative 3 feet from Natalie's position. She heard the impact, heard the weapon clatter across linoleum, heard someone shouting Code Blue, Trauma Bay 5 into a radio that hadn't activated yet. The spreading pool of blood beneath her had soaked through 2 layers of scrubs and was working on the 3rd. Pain was information. Pain was data. Shock was a luxury her body couldn't afford yet, and Natalie's training recognized the difference. She fumbled for the tourniquet kit in her pocket, muscle memory again, the same hands that had held insurgents' arteries together in a compound outside Anbar province now performing the procedure on herself with 1 functional limb, her jaw clenched so tightly her molars ached. The tourniquet went on at 9:34 p.m. Above the shoulder, 3 fingers width down the arm, tightened until the bleeding slowed to a seep. Her blood pressure was already dropping, she could feel it in the dimming periphery of her vision, the way the fluorescent light seemed to pulse like a heartbeat. She pressed her right hand against the entry wound and looked up. Dr. Kim, a 3rd-year resident, stood frozen 3 feet away. Pale. Trembling. Useless. Dr. Kim. Natalie's voice sounded like it came from underwater, like something from another body. Captain Webb has acute cardiac tamponade. The trauma did it. Listen to me. Dr. Kim didn't move. Listen. To me. The command voice didn't ask. Didn't negotiate. The voice that had directed 214 Marines through a city block in Mosul. The voice that came from bone-deep authority earned on ground where mistakes became funerals. You're going to push 1 milligram epinephrine for. Right now. Do it. The resident fumbled for the drug, hands shaking as orderlies were rolling Webb toward the resuscitation bay. His oxygen saturation was dropping, 78% on room air, then 73, then 68. The cardiac monitor showed sinus tachycardia at 142 beats per minute. The pressure in his chest was killing him from the inside out, each heartbeat forcing blood into pericardial fluid that had nowhere to go. Natalie's left arm was useless. Her left hand flopped against her side like something borrowed from a corpse. But her vision was clearing, the shock was holding position, buying her cognitive space. She was conscious enough to understand the mechanics. Webb needed pericardiocentesis. Someone needed to stick a needle through the pericardium and drain the fluid that was crushing his heart. 18-gauge spinal needle, she gasped. Prep the kit. You're doing this. I can't. You can. I'll talk you through it. Natalie's blood dripped onto the tile. She could see it pooling now, spreading in a rust-colored corona around her right foot. 60 milliliters in that sack and he's gone. You have 4 minutes. Maybe 3. Get the kit. Dr. Kim moved. Not with confidence. With terror. But he moved. The needle went through the rib cage at the angle Natalie dictated, just below Webb's xiphoid process, angling toward his left shoulder blade. Her blood was singing now, that high-pitched frequency of extreme blood loss. Someone had thrown a trauma blanket over her shoulders. Someone else was running fluids, 2 large bore 4s, probably. She could hear the pump alarm start its rhythmic protest. Pressure bag inflating. O2 mask. The sensations were happening to another person. A distant person. Feel the resistance? Natalie asked. Why, yes. Push through. Slow. Steady pressure. That's the pericardium. The needle pierced. The resistance released. Dr. Kim's hands opened the stopcock and 60 milliliters of blood-stained fluid drained into a basin like opening a pressure valve on a boiler. Webb's oxygen saturation ticked up. 72, 76. 82, his blood pressure climbed. The monitor shifted from the staccato panic of tamponade to the more sustainable rhythm of a body that remembered how to function. Good, Natalie whispered. That's good work. She wasn't sure if she said it aloud or if it was just the machinery of her consciousness grinding on through the grey static. The trauma surgeon was running now, her voice calling for a type and cross, calling for OR prep, calling for massive transfusion protocol. Natalie's field tourniquet was being photographed by someone who understood what it meant. A field tourniquet on a medical professional usually meant either a story or a funeral. At 9:11 p.m., they wheeled her toward the ER. At 9:53 p.m., a surgeon started rebuilding her shoulder with steel plates and titanium screws that would never feel quite right again. 23 sutures. Bone fragments that wouldn't realign. Permanent nerve damage to the lateral brachial cutaneous nerve that would leave a patch of her shoulder permanently numb, like a map of a place she couldn't return to. But Captain Marcus Webb was breathing. Heart rate stable. O2 sat 94% and climbing. The man whose life she'd pulled from burning wreckage 20 years ago would survive another day. At 10:52 p.m., while a surgeon was still working on the final sutures, Administrator Patricia Voss and Security Chief Hammond arrived at her gurney with a cardboard box containing the contents of her locker. Voss had a prepared statement in her hands, the legal language already smooth from rehearsal, already formatted for the record. "We're accepting your resignation effective immediately," Voss said. Her voice could have been narrating a weather forecast. Tonight's incident created unacceptable risk. Your unauthorized medical direction to staff. Your violation of non-engagement protocols. Your pattern of behavioral concerns. We have no choice but to part ways. Behind them, visible through the glass partition of the ER bay, Dr. Caldwell stood in the hallway on his phone. His smile had edges like broken glass. He was already making calls to board members he'd cultivated over 7 years, to the state nursing board, to a risk management consultant he kept on retainer, to a lawyer who understood that the best defense was a preemptive offense, special forces operative conducting unauthorized military operations on civilian premises. Liability. Danger. Threat to patient safety. The narrative was already written. The talking points were already circulating. Natalie signed the separation papers with her right hand at 11:14 p.m. Her left arm was immobilized, pain medication making the world feel like she was underwater, watching herself from outside her body. The signature was steady. Controlled. The handwriting of someone who understood that showing weakness was a mistake, now and always. At 11:38 p.m., they escorted her to the basement laundry room at shift change. The only time a terminated employee could access their personal locker without supervision. The industrial washers hummed their mechanical rhythm. The smell of bleach and hot linen filled the air like a chlorine cloud. Third-shift workers pretended not to stare as she pulled her blood-soaked scrubs from the cardboard box with her good arm. She folded them one final time. The fabric was still warm. 21 days of work, a fraud case that should have taken 6 months to document, now exposed but useless because her cover was compromised. Webb was alive. But her mission was over. She placed the folded scrubs on the sorting table and walked out through the loading dock at 12:01 a.m. The rain outside hit the asphalt like applause from a crowd that didn't exist. What happened next would change everything. Dr. Caldwell arrived at Cedar Creek Medical at 12:48 a.m., 3 hours after the gunshot, and the first thing he saw was blood. Not on a monitor screen. Not in a chart. On the linoleum floor of the emergency department, a spreading rust-colored stain that led from Trauma Bay 3 to the surgical suite like a trail only he could read. His face went white for exactly 2 seconds. Then it went calculating. He'd spent 20 years cultivating board members, and he knew exactly which ones had phones that would ring at 1 a.m. His voice was smooth as silk when he made the first call to Trustee Hutchins, the hospital's largest donor, a real estate developer who valued discretion above all things. "We have a serious liability situation," Caldwell said, keeping his tone grave but controlled. The new nurse violated critical protocol. Engaged in vigilante heroics that endangered multiple patients. The gunman was already in custody, but she inserted herself, created chaos, got shot for it. Now we're looking at negligent suits from families, OSHA violations, potential criminal charges if the wrong people think we enabled her recklessness. What Caldwell didn't know was that the security camera footage already existed. That it showed him nowhere near the ICU when the shooting happened. That it showed Natalie between the gun and Webb, her body moving before her mind could register the decision, muscle memory from 2 decades of protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. But Caldwell had something better than truth, he had narrative control, and he knew how to use it. By 1:15 a.m., he'd called 3 more board members. By 2 a.m., he'd positioned himself in the administrative hallway outside the ER, close enough to be seen but far enough to maintain deniability, shaking his head sadly at a cluster of residents as he discussed the tragedy of staff overstepping their training. Someone's phone camera caught him there, framed against the fluorescent glare, looking genuinely concerned. That image would matter later. At 2:37 a.m., while Natalie sat in Trauma Bay 3 with her shoulder wrapped in fresh gauze and her left arm immobilized against her torso, a hospital administrator named Peters arrived with papers already printed. His face had the particular exhaustion of a man who'd been woken by 3 board members and given explicit instructions. He didn't make eye contact when he spoke. "Master Chief," he began, then caught himself. "Ms. Hayes. We need to discuss your continued employment." Her voice was flat. Steady. The voice of someone who'd already calculated all possible outcomes. "I'm being fired." "We're accepting your resignation," Peters corrected, as if the distinction mattered. "Effective immediately. For the safety of all involved." You understand. Natalie understood perfectly. She understood that Dr. Caldwell had moved faster than she'd anticipated. That her cover was being blown not by discovery but by erasure. That the one thing she couldn't afford, visibility, was exactly what she'd created by stepping between a gun and a patient. The irony was the kind that made her jaw clench once, her hands perfectly steady even as Peters slid the resignation form across the examination table. "I'll need to collect my personal items," she said. "Administration will escort you." They did. 2 security officers, neither unkind, walked her downstairs to her locker in the basement laundry room at 3:14 a.m., during that dead hour when the hospital belonged to ghosts and machines. The night shift supervisor didn't look up from her folding station. The fluorescent light buzzed overhead like an insect trapped in amber. Natalie's locker was small. 3 weeks' worth of accumulated civilian life, a hairbrush, a protein bar, a phone charger, a framed photo she'd never actually put on display. And her scrubs. The ones from yesterday's shift. They were in the hamper, bloodstained and waiting for industrial washing, and she pulled them out with her good arm, her right, her dominant, the one that had held surgical instruments and military weapons with equal precision. The fabric was still warm. She stood there in the basement laundry room of a hospital that no longer wanted her, holding her own blood-soaked scrubs with one functioning arm, while the industrial washers hummed their mechanical rhythm around her. The mission was over. Captain Webb was alive. But her cover, the entire operational identity she'd maintained for 3 weeks, had been incinerated in the time it took for a bullet to travel 18 inches through soft tissue and bone. She'd taken a bullet. She'd saved a life. And she'd been erased before she could save the investigation that might have protected thousands of other patients. The scrubs went into a biohazard bag. She left the hospital at 3:42 a.m. wearing civilian clothes that didn't fit her military bearing, walking out through an employee entrance that nobody monitored, watching Savannah's pre-dawn darkness like a soldier exiting a failed operation. She didn't know what waited for her when the sun came up. The sun came up at 6:14 a.m., and by 7 a.m., there was a new patient in the ICU, a captured insurgent, now transferred to Cedar Creek Medical for medical evaluation before federal detention. His name was Rashid Ul-Hakim, and he'd spent for years in Fallujah working logistics for the insurgent network. He'd been in Jolan District on the day in 2004 when a female operator had extracted 8 civilians from a collapsed building while taking fire from 3 positions simultaneously. He'd seen her photograph in operational intelligence briefs for years afterward. Al-Malik al-Aswad. The Black Angel. He saw her at 7:06 a.m. when she walked past his isolation room to retrieve her final paycheck from Human Resources. His eyes went wide. Wide enough that the guard noticed. Wide enough that Rashid whispered the code name before his mind could stop him, his voice barely audible through the sealed door of Al-Malik al-Aswad. The nurse beside her, a young resident named Catherine, didn't recognize the Arabic. But the security guard did. Master Sergeant Thomas Holloway, retired 75th Ranger Regiment, had spent enough time in Iraqi intelligence briefs to know exactly what he'd just heard. His spine straightened like someone had inserted steel down his vertebral column. "Master Chief on deck," he said. Not loud. Not theatrical. The way you announce something that makes the air in a room change pressure. The casual statement hung there. In the hallway of Cedar Creek Medical, 3 floors above the emergency department, in the ordinary morning light of a Tuesday in September. And then the doors to the ICU waiting room swung open, because Admiral James Cross had been sitting there for the past hour, reviewing Natalie's service record, and he'd heard every word. Admiral Cross was tall the way aircraft carriers are impressive, not through effort but through the simple fact of existing. His uniform carried medals in descending bars of color: Navy Achievement, Meritorious Service, Joint Service Commendation, Navy Commendation. But he wore them the way other men wore shirts: present, unremarkable, earned through decades of work that had nothing to do with decoration. "Explain," he said to Natalie. Not a question. A command. The transformation happened in the space of a breath. The deferential civilian nurse vanished. What remained had her same face, same build, same bone structure, but an entirely different center of gravity. She stood at perfect parade rest without thinking about it. Her voice dropped an octave, the voice that had directed trauma teams and commanded respect from people who'd survived things that broke normal humans. Captain Marcus Webb, sir. Combat casualty from my last deployment, Fallujah 2004. Civilian extraction under fire. Admitted to this facility on rotation. Threat assessment indicated potential witness termination. I assumed undercover nursing position to provide continuous protection. The Admiral's expression didn't change. And your identity? Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes, Naval Special Forces, attached to JSOC Task Force Operations. Service record should reflect active clearances. By that point, Catherine had stepped back against the wall. Captain Webb, conscious now, sedation protocols eased following successful pericardiocentesis, had heard his own name, and despite the pain in his chest and the exhaustion of recovery, he'd managed to get himself into the hallway using the four-pole as a crutch. He was pale as hospital linen, but his voice was steady. "She saved me," Webb said. His eyes moved across the assembled people, the Admiral, the residents, the security guard, the three nurses who'd stopped to stare. 20 years ago in Fallujah. I was 7 years old. Caught in crossfire. Building collapsed. She dug me out with her hands while insurgents were shooting. He paused, and his eyes found Natalie. Yesterday, she took a bullet. For me. Again. The silence lasted exactly 10 seconds. Long enough for the hospital to understand what it was standing inside. Long enough for the Admiral to process. Long enough for Rashid to understand that he'd just exposed one of the most closely guarded classified operations in Special Forces history. The Admiral spoke first. "Master Chief, explain why a decorated officer with your clearance and service record is apparently mopping floors in Savannah, Georgia." And that's when the real investigation began. The audit that Admiral cross-triggered, not with anger or official channels, but with a single phone call to the Navy Inspector General, moved like precision machinery. By 4 p.m., federal investigators had occupied a conference room on the hospital's administrative floor. By 6 p.m., they traced the phantom billing pattern through Cedar Creek's surgical logs. $700,000. Procedures marked as performed on military patients whose actual medical records showed no corresponding treatment. Insurance claims filed for surgeries that existed only on paper. Dr. Caldwell had made one critical error: he'd assumed military patients were harder to audit. What he hadn't known was that every active duty and retiree service member's medical records existed in at least 3 separate systems. Army Medical Command, VA databases, TRICARE records. Cross-referencing took a federal investigator exactly 90 minutes. By midnight, the Georgia Medical Board had opened a formal ethics investigation. By 1 a.m., the hospital board voted 8-0 to terminate Caldwell's employment and refer the case to the district attorney for criminal prosecution. By 2:17 a.m., federal marshals arrived with an arrest warrant for 18 counts of healthcare fraud. But the thing that ended his career, truly ended it, in a way that no court ruling or suspension could match, was something that happened at 7:23 p.m. on that same Tuesday. Dr. Richard Morrison, the legendary cardiothoracic surgeon who'd written Caldwell's medical school recommendation in 1997, published an editorial in the New England Journal of Medicine. The title was "When We Fail to Teach Humanity." In it, he detailed watching video footage of Caldwell knocking a cafeteria tray from the hands of a decorated war hero. He described mentoring Caldwell through residency and ignoring warning signs about his character that he now deeply regretted. He formally requested that Johns Hopkins remove Caldwell's name from their alumni directory. He called for a cultural reckoning in medical education about how hospitals could produce surgeons who believed that cruelty demonstrated power. The piece went viral in medical circles within 3 hours. By morning, it had been shared 47,000 times. Medical school directors across the country began reviewing their own resident training programs, looking for the next Caldwell, asking themselves what they'd missed. The final punishment, though, the one that Caldwell would spend the rest of his life thinking about, wasn't legal. It was worse. 6 months later, on a morning in March, Cedar Creek Medical held a dedication ceremony for a new Ethics and Veteran Services wing. The building cost $4 million. It had Natalie's name on the plaque. On the stage stood Admiral Cross and Captain Webb in his dress uniform, back to active duty, healing but functional, and Natalie in white so crisp they looked like they could cut, her left shoulder still slightly stiff but operational. Across town, in a strip mall parking lot where the asphalt reflected heat like molten glass, Dr. Caldwell sat at a folding table with boxes of cheap insurance flyers. His medical license was suspended pending trial. His malpractice insurance had been cancelled. His wife had filed for divorce, citing reputational damage. The board members he'd cultivated for 15 years had issued statements claiming they'd always had concerns about his character. He sat at that folding table in 100-degree heat, wearing a polo shirt with a company logo, watching people walk past without taking his flyers. Watching Dr. Morris, the resident who'd laughed and filmed the cafeteria incident, walk across the parking lot and deliberately look away. Nobody wanted what he was selling anymore. In Admiral Cross's office at Naval Medical Command, a pair of worn combat boots sat on the corner of his desk. They were from Fallujah, 2004. The leather was cracked, the laces frayed, and if you looked closely, you could still see the dried blood of a 7-year-old boy stained into the canvas sides. Natalie stood at the window overlooking the parade ground, watching young sailors in formation, and she said something to Admiral Cross that would become the unofficial motto of the newly created Naval Special Investigations Unit. "Power is not a title," she said quietly. "Power is the ability to help." Below, the flag snapped against its pole in the Carolina wind, and somewhere in Savannah, the doors of Cedar Creek Medical opened for the afternoon shift. Every chart now routed through triple verification. Every staff member knew the story. And at her desk in the Navy Medical Inspector General's office, Master Chief Petty Officer Natalie Hayes had her new orders, her new mission, and the knowledge that taking a bullet for someone wasn't sacrifice if it meant protecting thousands of others from the people who wanted to exploit them. If you made it this far, you understand now, sometimes the most dangerous person in a room isn't the one with the uniform or the medals. It's the one everyone underestimated. Like and subscribe for more stories about the people who walk among us, silent and powerful, changing the world when nobody's watching. And comment, have you ever been underestimated by someone who didn't know who you really were?